The flight from New York to Los Angeles should have been just another routine trip for the pilot. He was a man in his late 30s, with salt and pepper hair and a calm demeanor that came from years of flying. People often described him as someone who seemed to carry the weight of the world lightly, but those close to him knew he had strong opinions about fairness and equality. That's why when he noticed something unusual happening in first class, he couldn't help but get involved. It started when he stepped out of the cockpit during a quiet moment. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with soft murmurs from passengers scrolling through their phones or sipping on drinks. First class was different, it always was. Here, people lounged in wide leather seats, their bags marked with designer logos. But today, there was tension in the air. Two men were deep in conversation, their voices low but intense. One of them looked familiar, a politician known for stirring up controversy with his speeches. The other man was younger, dressed sharply, exuding confidence. They weren't shouting, but the energy between them felt charged, like two boxers, circling each other before throwing punches. The pilot paused, pretending to adjust the overhead compartments. His eyes darted toward them, trying not to be obvious. The politician, everyone called him the senator, was leaning forward, gesturing emphatically. Whatever he was saying, it clearly meant business. The younger man listened quietly, nodding occasionally but keeping his expression unreadable. Something about this scene gnawed at the pilot. Maybe it was the way the senator spoke so confidently, as if no one could challenge him. Or maybe it was the younger man's silence, which felt deliberate, almost strategic. Either way, the pilot found himself drawn closer, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. He moved down the aisle under the pretense of checking seatbelts and offering water bottles. When he reached the row behind the two men, he slowed down. Now he could hear fragments of their conversation. Words like tax cuts, regulations, and opportunities floated into his ears. At first it sounded like any other discussion about money and politics, but then the senator said something that made the pilot's stomach churn. He talked about exploiting natural resources without caring about the impact on local communities. It wasn't new information. The pilot had heard similar things before. Yet hearing it now in this setting felt wrong. The pilot hesitated for a second. Should he say something? Normally, he kept his personal views out of work. Pilots were supposed to remain neutral, focusing on getting everyone safely to their destination. But this time, something inside him pushed back against staying silent. He reminded himself that he was still human, not just a uniform walking down the aisle. Taking a deep breath, he approached the pair, clipboard in hand. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone casual but firm. Both men looked up, surprised by the interruption. The senator gave a tight smile while the younger man raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The pilot didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he dove right in, addressing the senator directly. "I overheard part of your conversation," he admitted, meeting the man's gaze. "Some of the policies you support, they hurt real people. Families lose their homes because of those tax cuts. Communities suffer when regulations disappear. Have you ever thought about that?" For a moment, the senator just stared at him, clearly caught off guard. Then his face hardened. "This isn't really the place for a political debate," he replied curtly, glancing around as if hoping someone would agree with him. But instead of backing off, the pilot stood his ground. Passengers nearby began to pay attention, craning their necks to see what was happening. A few even nodded approvingly, silently encouraging the pilot to continue. That's when the younger man spoke up. Until now, he'd been watching silently, letting the senator do most of the talking, but his voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Actually," he said smoothly, turning to face the senator, "he has a point." Everyone froze, including the pilot. No one expected the younger man to take sides, let alone side against the senator. What followed was a moment of pure unpredictability, one that would set the stage for everything else to come. The younger man's words hung in the air like a challenge. "He has a point," he repeated, his tone calm but firm. The senator blinked, clearly unprepared for this twist. For a moment, the entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even the flight attendants paused mid-step, their trays of drinks momentarily forgotten. The pilot, who had been bracing himself for a sharp rebuttal from the senator, felt a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected backup, especially not from someone who looked like they belonged in the same world as the politician. The younger man leaned back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was something calculated about the way he spoke. "You talk a lot about freedom and opportunity," he said, addressing the senator directly. "But let's be honest, those policies you're pushing, they don't benefit everyone. They only line the pockets of people who already have plenty." His voice carried just enough edge to make the senator shift uncomfortably in his seat. The senator tried to laugh it off, waving a hand dismissively. "Come on now," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're talking about creating jobs, boosting the economy. You can't deny that deregulation helps businesses grow." But the younger man wasn't having it. He tilted his head slightly, studying the senator with an intensity that made the older man squirm. "Sure, it helps some businesses grow," the younger man replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But at what cost? Have you seen the data on how these policies affect low-income families, or do you even care?" Passengers nearby exchanged glances, some nodding along while others whispered to their companions. A woman in the row behind pulled out her phone, discreetly recording the exchange. The senator noticed and frowned, his confidence visibly waning. The pilot, standing just a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity. There was something oddly satisfying about seeing the senator get called out, especially by someone who seemed to know exactly what they were talking about. But the young man's involvement also raised questions. Who was he, really? Why was he traveling in first class, dressed like he belonged in a boardroom, yet speaking with such conviction about issues that usually didn't concern people in his position? As if sensing the unspoken question, the younger man turned his attention briefly to the pilot. "You're right to speak up," he said, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. "People like him," he gestured toward the senator, "count on us staying quiet. They rely on apathy to keep their systems running." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The pilot felt a strange connection to this stranger, as though they were united by a shared understanding of how unfair the system could be. The senator, now visibly irritated, attempted to regain control of the conversation. "Look, I'm not here to justify myself to either of you," he snapped, his polished facade cracking. "If you don't agree with my policies, fine, but don't lecture me about things you don't fully understand." His voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from the surrounding passengers. A man 2 rows down muttered, "Oh, this is getting good," earning a chuckle from his neighbor. The younger man smirked, unfazed by the senator's attempt to shut him down. "Actually," he countered, leaning forward again, "I understand. More than you think. I've read your voting record, your campaign contributions, the whole 9 yards, and frankly, it's hard to take you seriously when your actions don't match your rhetoric." This time the senator's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find a comeback. The pilot couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for the younger man. He was articulate, confident, and unafraid to call out hypocrisy when he saw it. Yet, there was still something about him that didn't quite add up. Was he genuinely passionate about these issues, or was he simply enjoying the chance to rattle the senator? Either way, the confrontation was far from over, and the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. For the passengers watching, the scene was equal parts entertaining and thought-provoking. It wasn't every day you witnessed a heated debate at 35,000 feet, especially one involving a high-profile politician. Some people clapped softly, while others whispered comments like, "Finally, someone's calling him out." The senator glanced around nervously, realizing he was losing the room. He adjusted his tie, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, but the cracks in his armor were starting to show. The younger man leaned back again, folding his arms across his chest. "Let's move past the platitudes," he said coolly. "Tell me something real. How does cutting environmental regulations create opportunity for the average person? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like another gift to big corporations." His question hung in the air, unanswered. The senator stared at him, jaw clenched, unsure of how to respond, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. What had started as a simple disagreement between a pilot and a politician had evolved into something much bigger, a public reckoning, played out in front of dozens of witnesses. As the conversation continued, it became clear that this encounter was about more than just policy. It was about accountability, privilege, and the uncomfortable truths that often go unspoken. For the pilot, it was also a reminder that sometimes standing up for what's right means stepping outside your comfort zone, even if that means confronting powerful people in a cramped airplane cabin. The senator's silence spoke volumes. He sat there, gripping the armrests of his seat like he was trying to steady himself on a ship caught in a storm. His face was flushed and sweat beaded at his temples. For someone who made a living talking circles around tough questions, he suddenly looked lost. The younger man's words had hit their mark, exposing the contradictions in his arguments. It was one thing to defend your beliefs behind a podium or in front of cameras. It was another to do so when cornered in a cramped airplane cabin with dozens of eyes watching your every move. The pilot, still standing nearby, couldn't help but feel a mix of satisfaction and unease. On one hand, it felt good to see someone hold the senator accountable. On the other hand, there was something unsettling about the younger man's confidence, like he knew exactly how this conversation would play out before it even began. Was he genuinely passionate about these issues, or was he playing some kind of game? The pilot couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this stranger than met the eye. The younger man leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Do you really believe what you're saying? Or are you just repeating lines fed to you by lobbyists?" The question hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to cut through any attempt at deflection. Passengers leaned closer, eager to hear the response. A few people whispered excitedly, while others simply stared, waiting for the senator to break his silence. Finally, the senator cleared his throat, forcing a smile. That didn't reach his eyes. "I don't have time for baseless accusations," he said, his tone clipped. "If you want to discuss policy seriously, fine, but throwing around insults doesn't accomplish anything." His attempt to sound reasonable only made him look more defensive. The younger man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Insults?" he repeated, letting out a short laugh. "You think pointing out hypocrisy is an insult? Maybe if you spent less time spinning stories and more time addressing real problems, we wouldn't be having this conversation." His words landed like punches, each one hitting harder than the last. The senator shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the cabin as if searching for an escape route. But there was no way out, not at 35,000 feet. By now, the entire first-class section was buzzing with energy. Some passengers nodded approvingly, silently cheering on the young man and the pilot. Others looked uneasy, unsure whether to applaud or remain neutral. One woman in a bright red blazer whispered loudly to her companion, "This is better than reality TV." Her comment drew a few chuckles, breaking the tension momentarily. The pilot decided to step back into the fray. "You know," he said, addressing both men but keeping his focus on the senator, "people trust leaders to make decisions that benefit everyone, not just a select few. When policies hurt the most vulnerable, it's our responsibility to speak up." His voice carried authority, the kind that came from years of experience and a deep sense of fairness. The senator shot him a glare, but the pilot didn't flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, meeting the politician's gaze head-on. For a brief moment, the senator seemed to consider backing down. He adjusted his tie again, a nervous tic that betrayed his unease. But then he straightened up, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for one last stand. "Look," he said, raising his voice slightly, "we can debate all day, but nothing will change unless people take action. Blaming politicians won't solve anything." The younger man smirked, leaning back in his seat once more. "Funny coming from someone whose career depends on dodging accountability," he shot back. The quip earned a few murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Even the flight attendants, who were supposed to stay neutral, exchanged knowing looks. One of them gave the pilot a subtle thumbs up, which he acknowledged with a small smile. As the back and forth continued, the pilot found himself studying the younger man more closely. There was something magnetic about him, his poise, his sharp wit, the way he commanded attention without raising his voice. But there was also an undercurrent of mystery. Who was funding his travels? Why did he seem so well versed in political scandals? And why did he care enough to call out a powerful figure like the senator in such a public setting? The senator, sensing that he was losing ground, tried to pivot the conversation. "At least I'm doing something," he said, gesturing vaguely. "What about you two? What have you done to improve the system?" It was a desperate move, an attempt to shift the spotlight away from himself. But instead of deflecting the criticism, his question only fueled the fire. The younger man's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't miss a beat. "Fair point," he admitted, surprising everyone. "But unlike you, I don't pretend to have all the answers. What I do know is that transparency matters, accountability matters. And right now, neither of those things exists in your world." His words struck a chord, resonating with the passengers who had been quietly observing the exchange. The senator opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing he was trapped. Every attempt to defend himself only dug him deeper, into a hole. The younger man had anticipated every counter-argument, dismantling each one with precision. It was clear that this wasn't just a random encounter. It was a calculated move executed with surgical accuracy. As the debate wore on, the pilot began to wonder, what was the younger man's endgame? Was he genuinely trying to expose corruption? Or was he using this moment to further his own agenda? Either way, one thing was certain: the confrontation was far from over. And as the plane soared through the sky, the tension in the cabin reached new heights, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. The senator's face was a mix of frustration and desperation. He glanced around the cabin, his eyes darting between the passengers who were now fully invested in the unfolding drama. Some people had even pulled out their phones to record the exchange, holding them up discreetly or pretending to check messages while capturing every word. The younger man noticed this too, but instead of being rattled, he seemed to lean into it. His confidence didn't waver. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing moment. "You're good at dodging questions," the younger man said, leaning forward slightly. His tone wasn't mocking. It was measured, almost clinical, like a teacher pointing out a mistake to a student. "But let's talk specifics. You voted against environmental protections multiple times. Care to explain how that helps anyone outside your donor circle?" The senator hesitated. This was the kind of question reporters asked during press conferences, the ones he usually avoided by pivoting to vague talking points about economic growth. But here, trapped in a metal tube miles above the ground, there was no podium to hide behind. No aides whispering in his ear. All he had was himself, and right now that didn't feel like enough. "I'm not going to sit here and justify my decisions to someone I don't even know," the senator finally blurted out, his voice rising slightly. It was a weak attempt to regain control, but it only made him look more defensive. A few passengers exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed. One older gentleman in a navy suit muttered under his breath, "That's not an answer." The pilot stepped closer again, sensing an opening. "It's not about justifying yourself to him," he said, gesturing toward the younger man. "It's about explaining to everyone here why you think these policies are worth supporting. People deserve honesty." His words carried weight, especially coming from someone whose job was literally built on trust, keeping hundreds of lives safe thousands of feet in the air. The senator shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as if it had suddenly become too tight. For the first time, cracks began to show in his polished exterior. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by ordinary people. Back home, he could brush off criticism with rehearsed sound bites or simply walk away when things got uncomfortable. But here, escape wasn't an option. The younger man pressed further. "Let's take one example," he said, his voice steady. "Last year, you pushed for deregulating offshore drilling. That decision led to spills that devastated coastal communities. How do you sleep at night knowing you prioritized profits over people's livelihoods? This time the senator didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the younger man, his jaw tightening. There was something unsettling about the way the stranger spoke, with such precision, as though he'd done his homework down to the smallest detail. And maybe he had. Maybe this whole encounter wasn't random after all. The thought sent a chill through the senator, though he tried not to let it show. Well, the younger man prompted, raising an eyebrow. No clever comeback? No spin? The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, hanging on to every second. Even the flight attendants lingered nearby, pretending to tidy up but clearly eavesdropping. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. Everyone knew the senator was cornered, but no one could predict what he would say or do next. Finally, the senator cleared his throat. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Policy-making is complicated. Sometimes, tough choices have to be made for the greater good." The younger man snorted softly, shaking his head. "Greater good? Is that what you call it when families lose their homes because of flooding caused by climate change? Or when workers are left unemployed after industries collapse due to reckless deregulation? Spare us the platitudes." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone clapped lightly, then stopped abruptly, unsure if it was appropriate. Another passenger whispered, "He's got him pinned," loud enough for those around to hear. The senator glanced at the source of the comment, his face reddening further. At this point, the pilot decided to intervene again. "You're always talking about freedom and opportunity," he said, addressing the senator directly. "But real freedom means protecting people, not exploiting them. Real opportunity means lifting others up, not stepping on them to climb higher yourself." The senator opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For once, he seemed genuinely speechless. The younger man watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. Then, almost casually, he added, "And don't forget, we're watching. Everyone here is watching." That last line hit hard. The senator glanced around the cabin, taking in the sea of faces staring back at him. Some looked angry, others intrigued, and a few simply curious. But none of them looked sympathetic. For a man accustomed to commanding respect, or at least, feigned admiration, the realization that he had none of it here must have stung deeply. As the conversation paused momentarily, the younger man turned his attention briefly to the pilot. "You're brave for speaking up," he said quietly, his tone softer now. "Most people wouldn't risk stepping into situations like this." The pilot nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement, but still wary. "Someone has to," he replied, simply. "If we stay silent, nothing changes." For a fleeting moment, it felt like they were allies, united by a shared sense of purpose. But the pilot couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the younger man's involvement than met the eye. Who exactly was he? Why did he care so much about exposing the senator? And where would this confrontation lead next? The tension in the cabin remained palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. As the plane continued its journey across the sky, the debate simmered on, unresolved, but far from forgotten. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. This was a moment none of the passengers or the senator would soon forget. The senator's shoulders sagged slightly, his usual bravado crumbling under the weight of the scrutiny. He glanced at his watch, perhaps hoping the flight would magically end sooner, but the digital numbers ticked away mercilessly. The younger man noticed this small gesture and smirked, leaning back in his seat as if to say, "You're not going anywhere." "Let's be honest," the younger man continued, his voice calm but cutting. "When you talk about freedom and opportunity, what you really mean is freedom for corporations to do whatever they want, and opportunities for yourself to climb higher on their dime." His words landed like a punch, sharp and direct. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding slowly while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke up to defend the senator, not even the few who might have agreed with him privately. It was clear that he was losing this battle, and everyone could see it. The senator tried to rally, forcing a tight smile. "You're oversimplifying things," he said, his tone carrying a hint of desperation. "Running a country isn't as easy as sitting here criticizing from the sidelines. Real leadership requires compromise." "Compromise?" The younger man shot back, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call taking money from industries that pollute our air and water? Is that what you call ignoring the voices of people who actually live with the consequences of your decisions?" He leaned forward again, his piercing gaze locking onto the senator's. "Or is it just another word for selling out?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The senator looked around the cabin, searching for support, or maybe just a way to change the subject, but found none. Even the flight attendants, who were supposed to remain neutral, seemed unusually focused on tidying up nearby rows. One of them accidentally dropped a napkin, bending down to pick it up with exaggerated slowness, clearly eavesdropping. The pilot, standing a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. On one hand, he felt a surge of satisfaction seeing the senator get called out so publicly. On the other hand, the younger man's relentless interrogation raised questions. Was he genuinely fighting for justice, or was he enjoying the spectacle? A little too much? There was something almost theatrical about the way he dismantled the senator's arguments, like he'd rehearsed every line beforehand. "You think I'm doing this for fun?" the younger man asked suddenly, as if reading the pilot's thoughts. He turned to face him, his expression serious now. "I'm not here to entertain anyone. I'm here because silence is complicity. If we don't challenge people like him," he gestured toward the senator, "then nothing will ever change." His words struck a chord with the passengers. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress nodded emphatically, whispering to her neighbor, "He's right. Someone has to stand up." Others murmured in agreement, their earlier curiosity giving way to quiet admiration for both the young man and the pilot. For a moment, it felt like the entire cabin was united against the senator, who sat stiffly in his seat, looking increasingly isolated. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, the senator did something unexpected. He stood up abruptly, grabbing his briefcase from the overhead compartment. "This conversation is pointless," he declared, his voice louder than necessary. "If you two are so passionate about making a difference, why don't you run for office yourselves instead of wasting time harassing me?" The cabin fell silent. Everyone stared at him, unsure how to react. Some passengers looked offended by his dismissal, while others seemed amused by his attempt to save face. The younger man didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, trust me," he said softly, his tone dripping with meaning. "I already have plans in motion." The senator froze, his hand gripping the edge of his seat. "What does that mean?" he demanded, his voice tinged with panic. The younger man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his legs casually as though savoring the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but laced with warning. "It means you're not untouchable, not anymore." The words sent a ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, murmuring among themselves. The senator's face paled, and for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Whatever confidence he'd clung to earlier had evaporated completely. He sank back into his seat, clutching his briefcase tightly as though it could shield him from the truth of the situation. The pilot stepped forward, breaking the uneasy silence. "You can walk away now," he said firmly, addressing the senator. "But remember this. Accountability doesn't stop when the plane lands. People are watching, and sooner or later actions catch up with everyone." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of movement as passengers adjusted in their seats. Then, without another word, the senator grabbed his coat and headed toward the lavatory, clearly eager to escape the spotlight. As he passed the pilot, he muttered something under his breath, words no one could quite hear. But the anger and frustration in his eyes said enough. Once he was gone, the cabin erupted into quiet chatter. Some passengers applauded softly while others discussed what they'd just witnessed. A teenager seated near the window turned to her mother and said, "That was wild." Her mom nodded, smiling faintly. Yeah, she replied. But it's about time someone said something. The younger man exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked tired, but satisfied. He glanced at the pilot, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. We made our point, he said simply. The pilot nodded back, though his mind was racing. Who was this man? What kind of plans was he referring to? And where would all of this lead once the plane touched down? One thing was certain. The events of this flight would leave a lasting impression, not just on those aboard, but possibly far beyond. The senator's retreat to the lavatory didn't bring an end to the tension in the cabin. If anything, it amplified it. Passengers whispered among themselves, piecing together what had just happened. The younger man sat quietly now, his earlier intensity replaced by a calm demeanor, as if he'd accomplished exactly what he set out to do. The pilot lingered nearby, still processing the confrontation. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface, something the younger man wasn't saying. As the minutes ticked by, the senator finally emerged from the lavatory. His face was pale, and his usual confident stride was replaced by hesitant steps. He avoided eye contact with anyone, sliding back into his seat like he wanted to disappear. But the damage was done. The passengers who had witnessed the exchange weren't about to forget it anytime soon. Some shot him disapproving glances, others simply ignored him altogether. It was clear he'd lost whatever authority or respect he might have walked onto the plane with. The younger man watched him settle back into his seat, then leaned forward slightly. You know, he said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to draw attention. Running away doesn't solve anything. The senator stiffened but didn't respond. Instead, he stared straight ahead, gripping the armrests of his seat tightly. For a moment it seemed like the younger man might press further, but instead, he turned his attention to the pilot. You handled yourself well, he said, his tone almost conversational now. Not everyone would have stepped in like you did. The pilot shrugged modestly, though he appreciated the acknowledgement. Someone has to stand up, he replied simply. If we don't, who will? The younger man nodded thoughtfully, then added, but standing up is only the first step. Real change takes more than words. It takes action. This statement hung in the air, prompting murmurs of agreement from nearby passengers. A businessman in a tailored suit leaned over and chimed in. Easier said than done, though. How do you even start fixing something this broken? The younger man smiled faintly, as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask that question. By holding people accountable, he said. By shining a light on the things they'd rather keep hidden. And by making sure no one gets away with thinking they're untouchable. His words resonated deeply, especially after what everyone had just seen. The senator shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly aware that all eyes were on him again, even if no one was speaking directly to him. For a man used to controlling narratives, this loss of control must have felt unbearable. Yet the younger man wasn't finished yet. You mentioned running for office earlier, he continued, addressing the senator without looking at him. Funny thing about power, it's fleeting unless you earn it honestly. And trust me, people are starting to notice when leaders aren't doing their jobs. The senator's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Whatever fight he'd had left in him seemed to have drained away. The younger man glanced around the cabin, meeting the curious stares of the passengers. This isn't about personal attacks, he clarified. It's about demanding better, from everyone. Leaders, corporations, even ourselves. We all play a part in shaping the world we live in. His tone softened slightly, becoming less confrontational and more reflective. I've spent years studying how systems work and fail. What I've learned is that change starts small. It starts with moments like this, where ordinary people decide they've had enough of being ignored or taken advantage of. The pilot listened intently, struck by the sincerity in the younger man's voice. There was no doubt he believed every word he was saying, but that lingering sense of mystery remained. Who was funding his travels? Why did he seem so connected to the inner workings of politics and business? These questions buzzed in the back of the pilot's mind, unanswered but impossible to ignore. Before anyone could ask, the younger man stood up, smoothing out his jacket. "Anyway," he said casually, "thanks for letting me vent. I'll leave you all to enjoy the rest of your flight." With that, he grabbed his carry-on bag and headed toward the economy section, leaving behind a stunned silence. For a few seconds, no one moved or spoke. Then slowly, the passengers began to process what had just happened. A young woman in the row behind pulled out her phone, typing furiously. "Did you see that?" she whispered to her friend. "That guy was intense but kind of inspiring." Her friend nodded, wide-eyed. "Yeah, but what was that about plans in motion? Do you think he's serious?" Nearby, the businessman muttered to himself, "Whatever he's planning, I hope it works. Someone needs to shake things up." The senator, meanwhile, stayed rooted in his seat, staring blankly at the seat back in front of him. He didn't say another word for the rest of the flight. As the plane descended toward Los Angeles, the pilot returned to the cockpit, his thoughts racing. He replayed the entire scene in his mind, the arguments, the accusations, the senator's defensiveness, and the younger man's cryptic warnings. Something told him this wasn't the last time he'd hear about any of it. Whether it was the younger man's mysterious plans or the ripple effect of the public confrontation, one thing was certain. Lives had been touched, perspectives shifted, and maybe, just maybe, change was closer than it seemed. When the plane finally landed, the passengers filed off quietly, many still discussing what they'd witnessed. As the senator hurried away, head down and shoulders hunched, the younger man disappeared into the crowd without a backward glance. The pilot watched them both go, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. This flight had been anything but routine, and its impact would linger long after the wheels touched the tarmac. By the time the plane taxied to its gate, the energy in the cabin had shifted. Passengers gathered their belongings, chatting animatedly about what they'd just witnessed. Some were fired up, eager to share the story with friends or post it online. Others seemed reflective, quietly processing how a routine flight had turned into something so extraordinary. The pilot stood near the cockpit door, watching as people disembarked. His uniform made him easy to spot, and several passengers stopped to thank him for speaking up. "You didn't have to do that," one older woman said, her eyes warm with gratitude. "But I'm glad you did. It gave us hope." The pilot smiled humbly, though he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: pride, uncertainty, even a touch of unease. He didn't consider himself a hero. He'd simply done what felt right. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The confrontation on the plane might have ended, but its ripple effects were only beginning. As the last few passengers filed off, the senator lingered behind, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When he finally stepped onto the jet bridge, his pace was quick, almost frantic. He disappeared into the bustling terminal without looking back, leaving behind an air of defeat. Meanwhile, the younger man who had ignited the entire debate blended seamlessly into the crowd, his presence fading like smoke. No one stopped him. No one questioned where he was headed next. But the pilot couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's actions would reverberate far beyond this day. Back in the terminal, life moved at its usual chaotic pace. Travelers rushed to catch connecting flights. Families reunited after long. Separations and announcements echoed over the intercom. Yet amidst the noise, snippets of conversation revealed that word of the mid-air showdown was spreading fast. A group of college students huddled near a charging station, laughing and speculating about the mysterious young man. "Do you think he's some kind of whistleblower?" one asked. Another shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe he's just someone tired of seeing people get away with nonsense." Nearby, a journalist scrolling through social media paused when she saw a video clip uploaded by one of the passengers. The caption read, "Senator gets roasted on a flight to LA." Within minutes, comments poured in, some praising the pilot and the young man, others defending the senator, and many more demanding answers. By the time the journalist finished watching, her phone buzzed with notifications. The story was already trending. For the pilot, stepping out of the airport felt surreal. The California sun warmed his skin, but his mind was still back on the plane. He replayed every moment, the heated exchange, the senator's defensiveness, the younger man's cryptic warnings. Something about the whole situation gnawed at him. Who was pulling the strings? Was the younger man truly fighting for justice, or was he playing a bigger game? And what role, if any, did the pilot now play in all of this? That evening, as he scrolled through news articles and social media posts about the incident, the pilot realized the impact was larger than he'd imagined. People weren't just talking about the confrontation. They were using it as a springboard to discuss broader issues. Environmental activists highlighted the dangers of deregulation. Labor unions pointed out how policies favored corporations over workers. Even late-night comedians joked about the senator's meltdown, turning the event into both entertainment and commentary. But amid the noise, one detail stood out. A reporter uncovered a connection between the senator and a string of controversial donations traced back to offshore accounts. Suddenly, the younger man's mention of plans in motion took on new meaning. Had he known about these links all along? Was this part of a larger strategy to expose corruption? The questions swirled endlessly, unanswered but impossible to ignore. Days later, the pilot received messages from strangers, emails, texts, even handwritten letters thanking him for standing up. One note, written in shaky handwriting, read, "Sometimes we forget that ordinary people can make a difference. You reminded me not to lose faith." Reading those words brought tears to his eyes. He hadn't sought recognition, but knowing he'd inspired others filled him with a quiet sense of purpose. Still, the mystery of the younger man lingered. Who was he? What was his endgame? These questions haunted the pilot, but they also pushed him to reflect on his own role in creating change. Maybe he couldn't unravel the web of power and influence overnight, but he could keep speaking up, keep challenging injustice wherever he saw it. That, he realized, was the real lesson of that flight. In the weeks that followed, the senator faced mounting pressure. Investigations into his campaign finances intensified, and public opinion turned sharply against him. Protesters gathered outside his office, holding signs that read, "Accountability starts now." Whether the younger man was directly involved or simply sparked a chain reaction, the outcome spoke volumes. No one, not even the powerful, was above scrutiny. As for the pilot, life returned to its usual rhythm. Flights came and went, each bringing new faces and stories. But the memory of that day stayed with him, etched into his mind like the horizon stretching endlessly before a plane. He carried it with him everywhere, a reminder that courage, no matter how small, could ignite change. And sometimes all it took was one voice to remind others that silence wasn't the answer. When he climbed into the cockpit again, ready to guide another journey across the sky, he felt a renewed determination. The world was messy, complicated, and often unfair. But moments like the one on that flight proved that even in the most unexpected places, people could find the strength to stand up, speak out, and demand better. After all, turbulence wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it cleared the way for smoother skies ahead.